At 1 minute past midnight on August 22nd, 2026, a 50% tariff hit $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. And the man everyone in Washington assumed would blink did something nobody in the Oval Office expected. He hung up the phone, walked out of the negotiating room, and told his own country that the deal on the table was not just bad. It was designed to make Canada into something less than a country. Within hours, Mark Carney had suspended trade talks entirely. And by the following Tuesday, his finance minister was standing at a podium in Ottawa saying 5 words that would end up on the front page of newspapers from Toronto to Tokyo. When the United States asked too much and offered too little, Canada chose Canada. This is the story of how a trade relationship between two of the closest allies on Earth collapsed into what its own prime minister has openly called a war, why the American side badly misjudged the man across the table from them, and what it actually means for steelworkers in Hamilton, dairy farmers in Wisconsin, auto plants in Oshawa and Michigan, and every person on both sides of a border that used to be the longest undefended line in the world. To really understand how Washington ended up this confident that Ottawa would eventually cave, you have to go back further than this past summer, all the way to the very first days of the second Trump administration. According to a timeline compiled by Reuters, the entire conflict traces back to February 1st, 2025, when Trump signed an executive order placing a 25% tariff on virtually all Canadian goods, and 10% specifically on Canadian energy, set to take effect just 3 days later. The stated justification at the time was not trade imbalance. It was fentanyl and illegal migration, with the White House alleging that Canada was functioning as a meaningful pipeline for the deadly opioid flowing into American cities. Canada's response, under then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was swift and, according to figures Trudeau himself cited at the time, arguably successful on its own terms. Ottawa rolled out a $1.3 billion border security plan, complete with new helicopters, surveillance technology, and close to 10,000 additional frontline personnel, appointed a dedicated fentanyl czar in the form of a veteran Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer named Kevin Brosseau, and formally designated 7 transnational criminal organizations as terrorist entities. Trudeau's government stated publicly that fentanyl seizures originating from Canada had dropped 97% down to a near zero low of 0.03 of a pound in the single month following the announcement, according to figures reported by the law firm McCarthy Tetrault. A phone call between Trump and Trudeau on February 3rd produced a 30-day pause, and for a moment it looked like a genuine crisis had been diffused through fairly conventional diplomacy. It did not stay diffused. According to that same Reuters timeline, the relationship went through an entire cycle of escalation and de-escalation over the following year and a half that reads, in retrospect, like a rehearsal for exactly what would happen in August of 2026. In June of 2025, the United States doubled its steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%. Later that same month, Carney, who had by then replaced Trudeau as Prime Minister, met Trump at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, and the two leaders set a 30-day target for reaching a comprehensive deal. That target collapsed within days when Trump abruptly ended talks over Canada's digital services tax, a measure aimed at large American technology companies. Canada rescinded the tax within 48 hours in an attempt to salvage the relationship. On July 31st, 2025, Trump raised tariffs on Canadian goods that didn't qualify for USMCA preferential treatment from 25% up to 35%. And in the depths of that first Trump term retaliation, Canada had responded to the original February tariffs with a retaliatory package worth close to 155 billion Canadian dollars, an enormous number that gives you a sense of just how large the total exposure between these two economies actually is, even before you get anywhere near the Section 338 fight that would come a year later. That entire 18-month history matters enormously for understanding the summer of 2026, because it establishes the pattern Washington had genuinely come to expect. Threaten tariffs, cite a justification, watch Ottawa make a concession, pause the threat, then escalate again a few months later when the underlying trade friction hadn't actually gone away. It worked more or less 4 separate times across 2025. By the time Trump reached for Section 338 in July of 2026, there was a real evidence-based reason inside the West Wing to believe the fifth escalation would follow the same script as the first 4. Which brings us to July 20th, 2026, when Donald Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking a law almost nobody outside a trade lawyer's office had ever heard of. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 gives a sitting president the power to impose tariffs of up to 50% on a country the administration decides is discriminating against American commerce. According to the White House's own fact sheet, no president had used this specific provision the way Trump was about to use it. Legal analysts at the trade law firm Holland and Knight noted that the statute had not been invoked this way since 1949, which means the tool Trump reached for had been sitting untouched through the entire Cold War, through NAFTA, through the original USMCA negotiation Trump himself signed during his first term. He was reaching all the way back to the Great Depression to build his leverage over Ottawa in 2026. The three proclamations targeted three specific Canadian sectors, and each one had its own backstory that mattered enormously to how this played out. The first targeted motor vehicles. The White House proclamation alleged that Canada's surtax order on American-made cars, introduced in 2025 as a countermeasure to Trump's own Section 232 auto tariffs, unfairly singled out American vehicles with a 25% tariff, while leaving cars from Japan, Germany, and South Korea untouched. According to the law firm White & Case, which tracked the filings closely, American vehicle exports to Canada had fallen roughly 22%, sliding from about $25.9 billion to $20.3 billion, comparing one 12-month period to the previous one, while manufacturers in Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and Germany moved in to fill the gap Detroit was losing. The second proclamation targeted dairy, and this one reached into one of the oldest and most sensitive fights in the entire Canada-U.S. trading relationship, Canada's supply management system. The complaint centered on how Canada allocates its tariff rate quota for cheese, giving European retailers access to a quota tied to the Canada-EU trade agreement, while restricting American retailers from an equivalent quota under the newer USMCA framework. It's a wonky, technical dispute, but it is one that has poisoned dairy negotiations between the two countries for the better part of a decade, because Canadian supply management is treated as close to untouchable in domestic politics, propping up thousands of family farms across Quebec, Ontario, and the Maritimes. The third proclamation, and arguably the pettiest and most consequential at the same time, targeted alcohol. This one traces directly back to a wave of provincial boycotts that started in March of 2025 when Canadian provinces and territories, angry about Trump's initial round of tariffs, directed their government-run liquor boards to pull American wine, beer, and spirits off the shelves entirely. According to the trade compliance firm GHY, those boycotts caused American alcohol exports to Canada to collapse by roughly 81%, while alcohol imports from other countries into Canada actually rose by about $170 million over the same stretch, with European and other producers quietly filling the gap left by absent American brands. The New York Post reported that U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer had specifically told Canadian officials that any successful renewal of the broader USMCA relationship would hinge on the provinces lifting those liquor bans. Ontario and British Columbia, according to reporting at the time, made clear they had no intention of complying even if a federal-level deal was struck, because provincial liquor boards in Canada operate independently of the federal government in Ottawa, a wrinkle in Canadian federalism that Washington's negotiators appear to have badly underestimated. Combined, these three proclamations, according to the U.S. Trade Representative's own estimate, covered close to $20 billion in Canadian imports, spread across hundreds of individual tariff classifications on the harmonized system used by customs officials. And here is the detail that caught even seasoned trade lawyers off guard when the tariffs actually went live. Unlike some of the earlier tariff regimes Trump had used against Canada, these Section 338 duties applied even to goods that would normally qualify for duty-free treatment under the existing USMCA framework. A valid certificate of origin, the kind Canadian exporters have relied on for years to move goods tariff-free across the border, did nothing to shield a shipment of Canadian wine or an Ontario-built car from this particular hammer. The tariffs were originally scheduled to take effect at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th. And this is where the story takes its first real twist, because just hours before that deadline, Trump did something that looked, for a moment, like the whole crisis was about to be resolved peacefully. He announced a 3-day pause. According to Axios, Trump said publicly that the United States and Canada had reached the outline of a broader deal covering market access, economic security commitments, and digital trade, with the final paperwork still being worked out. Dominic LeBlanc, Canada's trade minister responsible for the American file, told reporters on the Thursday before the deadline that a deal was, in his words, very close. It wasn't close enough. Late on Friday, August 21st, negotiations collapsed entirely. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told reporters, according to Bloomberg's reporting picked up by Axios, that Canada had introduced last-minute demands that upset the agreement the two sides had supposedly reached. Greer specifically pointed to Canada's continued retaliation measures, including what he called flat-out prohibitions on certain American goods and services, a direct reference to those provincial alcohol bans that simply would not go away no matter how much pressure Washington applied. From the Canadian side, the story sounded very different. Carney told reporters that in the final days of talks, the United States had proposed new terms that he described as uneconomic and unfair, terms that came in at the 11th hour after weeks of what he said had been genuine progress toward a deal that would have improved Canada's position. Whichever version of events you find more persuasive, the outcome was not in dispute. At midnight on Saturday, August 22nd, the 50% tariffs on that roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods went into effect exactly as scheduled. According to NBC News, the list of affected products included hockey sticks, building materials, liquor, wine, furniture, dairy products, cement, certain kinds of clothing, and fishing rods. An oddly specific and almost symbolic list that touched everything from Canadian kitchen tables to the country's most beloved national sport. And this is the moment Washington appears to have badly miscalculated. The expectation, according to multiple people close to the negotiations cited by Axios, was that Carney would do what he had done once before earlier in his term: absorb the pressure, make a concession, and come back to the table on terms favorable to the United States. Back in the spring, Carney had in fact lifted most of Canada's retaliatory tariffs following a phone call with Trump, a move Trump publicly called nice at the time. Conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre had seized on that earlier concession, calling it a sign of weakness. And for a moment it looked like the pattern of the entire relationship, going back through the original NAFTA renegotiation in Trump's first term, was going to repeat itself. Threaten, escalate, wait for Ottawa to bend. This time, Ottawa did not bend. Speaking in Ottawa on the Saturday after the deadline, Carney told reporters, and through them the entire country, that Canada would match Washington's new tariffs dollar for dollar in order to protect Canadian workers, farmers, families, and businesses. He went further than a simple tit-for-tat threat. According to reporting from Deseret News, Carney told Canadians directly that his government had recognized, in his words, that America has changed, and that Canada would not compromise its sovereignty or undermine its key industries to get a deal done. "We cannot accept what they offered," he said, "and we will not give what they asked." He described Canada as being, in effect, under attack from the scale and speed of Trump's tariff escalation. The retaliation Carney announced was not a symbolic gesture. According to CNN's reporting, Canada's countermeasures were set to take effect on September 8th and were structured to hit American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, deliberately mirroring the sectors the U.S. tariffs had targeted, dollar for dollar, industry for industry. Prime Minister Carney's own office, in a statement posted to the official website of the Prime Minister of Canada, specified that the retaliatory list would also extend to products already caught up in the disputed Section 232 and Section 338 tariff regimes, closing what might otherwise have been a loophole. Carney did not stop at tariffs. His government paired the retaliation with a domestic support package. According to CNBC, Canada's Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced an additional $7.5 billion package aimed at businesses and workers being harmed by the American tariffs, layered on top of what Carney's office says has already been nearly $25 billion in support delivered to Canadian workers and businesses over the preceding 18 months. Standing at that same news conference, Champagne delivered the line that within days was being quoted across international outlets from CNBC to smaller regional papers picking up the wire story. When the United States of America asked too much and offered too little, he said, "We made a choice. We chose Canada." If you want to understand why Carney felt he had the political room to take this stance rather than folding the way Washington expected, you need to look at the numbers coming out of Canadian polling in the weeks leading up to the collapse. According to the polling firm Liaison Strategies, which surveyed more than 1,500 Canadians between August 2nd and August 15th, Carney's personal approval rating stood at 60%, its highest level since early May, with his Liberal Party holding an 11-point lead over Poilievre's Conservatives. That same tracker had shown Carney's approval climbing steadily through the summer, from 57% in early August up to 60% by mid-month. According to Axios, a separate poll conducted in that same window found that most Canadians actually wanted a tougher approach in the trade talks, sentiment that was measured just days before the negotiations formally collapsed. In other words, Carney was not defying public opinion by walking away from the table. He was arguably following it. That is a strikingly different picture from where things had stood earlier in the year. According to the nonprofit polling group Angus Reid Institute, back when Carney had made the earlier decision to remove Canadian counter tariffs on American goods as part of an attempt to restart talks, his approval had actually dropped 6 points, with a substantial share of Canadians expressing either dissatisfaction or uncertainty about that concession. Poilievre had jumped on that moment as proof of weakness. It appears Carney learned something from that earlier dip in support. When the next crisis point arrived in August, he did not repeat the pattern of conciliation. He escalated instead, and the polling data suggests that decision reconnected him with a Canadian public that had grown tired of watching their government make concessions that never seemed to produce a lasting deal. Trump's reaction to Carney's refusal to fold tells you almost everything about how much this outcome caught the American side off guard. According to NBC News, on the Monday after the tariffs took effect, Trump posted on Truth Social that Canada has been ripping off the United States of America for years, adding that on trade, and in other ways also, they are among the worst nations in the world to deal with. He then threatened an entirely new round of escalation, saying he would hit imported cars, trucks, automobile parts, and steel with 50% tariffs starting January 1st. A threat that, if carried out, would go well beyond the goods already covered by the Section 338 proclamations and would strike directly at the integrated North American auto industry, an industry where, according to reporting on the sector, individual components can cross the Canada-U.S. border up to 8 times during the manufacturing process before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. Carney's response to that specific threat was calm and pointed. Asked when Canada would be willing to return to the negotiating table, Carney told reporters that before talks could resume, the United States would need to adopt what he called the right attitude toward Canadian industries. He described the posture he would not accept in unusually blunt terms for a head of government. An attitude at the negotiating table that Canada is a subsidiary of the United States, he said, that Canadian industry is going to be disadvantaged relative to American industry is not something he would accept. It is worth sitting with that phrase for a moment because it reframes the entire dispute. Carney was not describing this as a disagreement over tariff percentages or quota allocations. He was describing it as a dispute over whether Canada would be treated, going forward, as a sovereign trading partner or as an economic appendage of its much larger neighbor. There is also a piece of this puzzle that sits between the fentanyl origin story and the Section 338 escalation. And it matters because it shows the relationship souring even during periods that were officially described as calm. According to the Reuters timeline, Carney made his first visit to the Trump White House in the spring of 2025, specifically to try to reset relations after the rocky opening months, a trip that produced warm public language from both sides, but no durable agreement on the underlying tariff structure. That pattern of a personally cordial meeting followed by a return to hostilities within weeks would repeat itself more than once. Trump, according to NBC News, has said on multiple occasions that he personally likes Carney, describing their relationship in warm terms, even in the same public statements where he was threatening to escalate tariffs on Carney's own country. That contradiction, a genuinely warm personal rapport between the two men sitting alongside an increasingly bitter institutional trade war between their two governments, is one of the stranger threads running through this entire 2-year saga, and it is part of why so many observers in Washington seem to have assumed personal chemistry would eventually translate into a deal, right up until it didn't. The scale of what is actually at stake here is worth putting some numbers to. Canada remains the 3rd largest source of American imports, and according to United States Census Bureau data cited by NBC News, more than $380 billion worth of Canadian goods crossed into the United States last year alone. This is not a peripheral trading relationship being fought over at the margins. It is one of the largest bilateral trade relationships on the planet, and it is currently operating without the underlying framework that has governed it for years, because on July 1st, 2026, the Trump administration formally announced it would not renew the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement in its existing form, plunging the entire continental trade architecture into what analysts have described as a period of rolling annual reviews and open-ended negotiation, rather than the fixed, multi-year certainty that USMCA and NAFTA before it had provided for 3 decades. Trump did not stop at tariff threats. Also on that Tuesday, following the retaliation announcement, according to CNBC, Trump suggested on Truth Social that the United States would halt business dealings with the province of Ontario specifically, and he repeatedly floated, apparently only half joking, the idea of renaming Lake Ontario to Lake America. It is the kind of rhetorical flourish that plays well to a certain domestic audience, but that, inside Ottawa and inside the provincial government in Toronto, reads as confirmation of exactly the disrespect Carney has been describing publicly for months. To understand why the mood between these two governments had curdled this badly by the time the Section 338 tariffs hit, you have to go back roughly a year, to October of 2025, and an advertisement that on paper should have been a minor regional dispute and instead became a genuine diplomatic flashpoint. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's provincial government released a television ad, set to run on American networks, that used archival audio from a 1987 radio address by President Ronald Reagan warning against the economic damage caused by tariffs. The ad was designed to make an argument directly to American viewers, using an icon of the Republican Party's own history, that tariffs hurt the country, imposing them as much as the country they're aimed at. Trump's reaction was immediate and furious. According to the Globe and Mail, Trump abruptly suspended ongoing trade negotiations with Canada over the ad late on a Thursday night. and followed it within days with a proclamation adding an extra 10% on top of existing tariffs, a penalty explicitly tied in Trump's own public statements to the advertisement itself. He called the ad fraudulent and fake, and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute weighed in publicly as well, stating that the ad misrepresented Reagan's actual remarks and that Ontario had not obtained permission to use the recording. According to CBC News, Trump later told reporters aboard Air Force One that Carney had personally apologized to him for the ad, a claim Carney did confirm days later, saying publicly that he had seen the ad before it aired, had told Ford directly that he did not think it was a good idea, and that running it was not something he himself would have done. But here's the part of that story that matters most for understanding what happened 10 months later when the real tariff crisis hit. Doug Ford did not simply fold under the pressure either. According to the BBC, even after agreeing to pause the ad campaign following his own conversation with Carney, Ford let the commercial run through the entire weekend, including during Major League Baseball's World Series broadcasts, some of the highest viewership television slots in the entire American calendar, before finally pulling it on the Monday. By the time it came down, according to Axios, the ad had accumulated more than 1 billion views, and Ford stood in front of reporters afterward and said flatly, "We achieved our goal." Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew publicly urged Ford to keep the ad running rather than pull it, telling reporters that the ad presented Reagan's views on tariffs accurately and powerfully, and that Trump's tariffs went completely against Reagan's own legacy as a committed free trader. That episode, small as it might look in isolation, established a pattern that would repeat itself almost exactly during the Section 338 crisis the following August. Provincial and federal Canadian leaders, faced with American pressure and threats of even harsher tariffs, did not uniformly retreat. Some pushed back harder than Ottawa itself was initially prepared to. When the Section 338 alcohol tariffs specifically cited the provincial liquor board bans as the discriminatory practice justifying the 50% duty, reporting from Tech Times at the time noted that Ontario and British Columbia had made clear, even as federal negotiators worked toward a deal, that American wine, beer, and spirits would not automatically return to store shelves, even if Ottawa reached an agreement with Washington. Provincial liquor authorities in Canada operate with a degree of independence from the federal government that appears to have genuinely surprised American trade negotiators, who were negotiating with Ottawa as though a federal-level deal could deliver outcomes that, constitutionally, only the provinces themselves control. Reaction inside Canada to Carney's decision to walk away rather than negotiate under what he called uneconomic terms has not been uniformly celebratory, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative opposition leader, has criticized several of Carney's moves throughout this drawn-out conflict, at different points calling earlier concessions a sign of weakness, even as he has, at other moments, pushed for a tougher posture generally. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who is frequently aligned politically with Poilievre, had welcomed an earlier decision by Carney to lift most retaliatory tariffs back in the spring, a decision Ontario Premier Doug Ford at the time said he disagreed with, arguing instead for continued retaliation if a comprehensive deal wasn't struck soon. Business groups across the country have expressed a consistent message throughout the entire 18-month conflict, welcoming any de-escalation while also saying, according to CBC's reporting, that what they actually want most is stability, a word that has become almost a refrain among Canadian manufacturers, auto part suppliers, and cross-border logistics companies who have had to plan around a moving target of tariff rates for the better part of 2 years. There's a geographic dimension to this fight that is easy to miss if you only look at national-level numbers. The core of the Section 338 auto dispute runs directly through southern Ontario and the American Midwest, the two regions where the integrated North American auto supply chain is most heavily concentrated. And Ontario, in particular, has ended up at the center of nearly every major flashpoint in this entire saga, from the Reagan advertisement to the current tariff fight, to Trump's remarks about Lake Ontario itself. Ontario is not a peripheral player in this story. It is, in practical terms, the epicenter of it, which is part of why Doug Ford's own posture, more combative at times than the federal government's, has mattered so much to how this conflict has actually unfolded on the ground. The economic toll on specific sectors gives a sense of just how real the stakes are behind the political theater. According to TD Economics data cited in coverage of the dispute, Canadian auto production fell 5.4% in 2025 alone, a steeper decline than either the United States or Mexico experienced in the same period, a direct consequence of the uncertainty and cost pressure created by the escalating tariff regime on an industry that depends on components moving back and forth across the border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished. The General Motors assembly plant in Oshawa, Ontario, eliminated an entire production shift earlier in the year, a decision the company directly linked to the impact of American tariffs, according to CBC's ongoing coverage of the trade file. So where does this leave the relationship as of right now, in the closing days of August 2026? Canada's retaliatory tariffs are scheduled to take effect on September 8th, matching the American measures sector for sector on steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. Trump has threatened to escalate further starting January 1st with 50% tariffs on autos, trucks, auto parts, and steel that would go beyond what the Section 338 proclamations currently cover. Carney has said publicly that any return to the negotiating table depends on the United States first adopting what he has called the right attitude toward Canadian industry, language that suggests Ottawa is not simply waiting for the next American proposal, but is actively setting preconditions of its own for the first time in this entire multi-year dispute. And the broader USMCA framework that used to provide predictable rules for this entire relationship remains unrenewed, replaced for now by a rolling, year-to-year process of negotiation that leaves businesses on both sides of the border planning in the dark. It is worth being honest here about what remains genuinely uncertain, rather than pretending every thread of this story has a clean resolution. Whether Carney's current hardline represents a durable shift in Canadian trade strategy, or simply another peak in a cycle that has already swung between escalation and concession multiple times over the past 18 months, is not something that can be answered definitively right now. Both governments have, at various points in this dispute, blamed the other side for the breakdown of talks that both sides claimed, only days earlier, had been on the verge of success, and neither government's characterization of exactly what was offered and what was demanded in those final negotiating sessions in August has been independently verified beyond the public statements of officials, with an obvious interest in shaping the narrative in their own favor. Analysts cited by Axios, including Corpay's chief market strategist Carl Shamata, have suggested Carney may be calculating that America's own midterm elections in November could shift the political incentives in Washington enough to open the door to a more balanced deal down the road. But that is, by its nature, a forecast, rather than a confirmed fact, and it should be treated as one. What is confirmed, and what is not in dispute between either government, is this. Washington built its entire negotiating strategy in the summer of 2026 on the assumption that enough tariff pressure would eventually bring Ottawa back to the table on American terms, the way it arguably had earlier in Carney's term. When the moment of maximum pressure actually arrived at 1 minute past midnight on August 22nd, Mark Carney did not fold. He suspended talks, matched the tariffs dollar for dollar, backed Canadian workers and businesses with billions more in direct support. He told his own country, and by extension the White House, that Canada would not trade its sovereignty for a deal it considered unfair. Whatever comes next in this relationship, that moment and the political calculation behind it has already reshaped how both governments are likely to approach each other going forward. So here's the question worth sitting with. When one of the closest trading relationships in the world reaches a point where its own prime minister describes it using the language of an attack, and where a 5-word line from a finance minister, "We chose Canada," becomes a kind of national rallying cry, what does that tell you about where the balance of power in this relationship actually sits versus where Washington assumed it sat going in? I'd genuinely like to know what you think happens next, whether this cools off before the American midterms or whether it keeps escalating straight through January. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.